Good morning, everyone. We will start the program in 2 minutes. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Rachel Edita Rojas from the Computing Society of the Philippines, and I will be your moderator for this webinar lecture number 15. The Computing Society of the Philippines, or CSP, in cooperation with the Department of Computer Science of UP Diliman, would like to thank you for your participation in this lecture series, which we will be hosting today. Before we go to the lecture, we have some webinar rules that we would like to remind everyone of. All our participants will be able to post their questions that we want to ask our speaker. And we would like to remind everyone to indicate your name and your organization when you're asking your question. And we will be accepting your questions until the end of the talk. The lecture for today is entitled Meaningful and Actionable Practices for Program Assessment from 10 a.m. to 11:30 today, August 15, 2020, to be delivered by none other than a kababata of mine, Professor Ben Juliano, a professor of computer science at the California State University, Chico. This talk on accreditation and program assessment supports the initiative of the IT industry in the Philippines under the leadership of PICAB, or the Philippine Computer Society Information and Computing Accreditation Board. With four organizations together with it, of course, the PCS, or the Philippine Computer Society, the PSIA, or the Philippine Software Industry Association, PSITE, the Philippine Society of IT Educators, and CSP, the Computing Society of the Philippines. PICAB has been recognized by the signatories of the Seoul Accord as a provisional member since 2015. And we are eagerly looking forward to being a regular member soon. In this talk, we are privileged to have with us today Professor Ben Juliano, who will provide an overview of accreditation and program assessment based on his very comprehensive experience. He will share with us some best practices for program assessment and a case study regarding assessment processes. It is an honor to introduce to you our speaker for this webinar, Professor Ben Juliano. Professor Juliano is a professor of computer science at the California State University, Chico. He has a wide range of experience as administrator in his campus, including having served as the department chair of the electrical and computer engineering and as the college assessment coordinator, where he managed and facilitated all assessment, accreditation, and academic review efforts for all 11 undergraduate programs, 9 accredited, and 2 graduate programs offered in the college. He is an ABET professional development facilitator, an ABET senior ideal scholar, and an assessment leadership academy alumni of the Western Association of Schools and Colleges, which is the accrediting body for the Western region of the United States. He is a BS Computer Science graduate from UP Los Baños, so we are batchmates, same student number, and an MS and PhD in Computer Science from Florida State University. Professor Ben Juliano, on behalf of CSP, thank you so much for accepting our invite for you to speak today. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let me present to you Professor Ben Juliano. Thank you, Benj.
You're welcome. Good morning, everyone. Let me start my screen share here so we can begin our talk. So today's topic is on the meaningful and actionable practices for program assessment. And as I go over my talk, I will try to share some of my experiences and maybe some hints or tips for those of you who are interested in being involved in assessment. I am coming to you live from Chico, California. So I am currently in Northern California by the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountain ranges. Um, it's hot 111 degrees here earlier, which is about 44 there. So we still get the heat here from time to time. And as Rachel pointed out, my name is Ben Juliano, and I'm a professor of computer science here at Chico State. Um, Other things I want to share with you, I've been involved in artificial intelligence research as a graduate student. Even as an undergrad, maybe Dr. Rojas, Rachel will remember that my senior project as an undergrad was actually in intelligent tutoring systems. So I've always been interested in how we think and how we can use machines to emulate how we think. And I think that has gotten me also interested in assessment because it's very normal for us to say that, you know, we're doing our jobs, we're teaching our courses, the students are earning the grades they deserve, so things are working fine. But the big question is how can we really document and provide evidence that the students are learning what they are supposed to learn? And so that's the biggest question in assessment. Um, I've taught in multiple institutions here in the US. I've taught in Jacksonville, Florida, in the University of North Florida, and then in South Carolina. And then I eventually moved to Chico, California. And that's where my story begins. And actually, I've been in assessment since 2002. Um, uh, Kind of forced into it, so to speak. No one wants to do assessment. So, as a young faculty member at the time, my chair asked me if I would do assessment. And of course, I said yes. And that's kind of how my story in assessment began. I didn't know anything about it. And I tried a few approaches on how I can gather data to show how assessment works. And of course, there were some failures, and I had to learn from our failures. And then eventually, I developed some skills. So I'm going to kind of try to share some of those stories probably as we go through. So by the end of this webinar, my goal is that participants will hopefully be able to achieve the following, and I'm listing them as our learning objectives for today. We have a limited amount of time, so I'm going to be mindful of the time I'm using up here. So hopefully you will be able to develop a systems view of the program assessment process. This is a good way of organizing how you do things. Um, Also, hopefully you will be able to identify any potential improvements to your current program assessment process if you have one. When we get to the case study, when I share how we do program assessment here at Chico State, it doesn't mean that you have to copy what we do, because each unit, each department will have to develop a system that works for them, because there are many variables involved in trying to decide on a system that works. And then eventually, the other learning objective, the last one, is to be able to determine any potential sustainable assessment practices that might apply to your program. So there are some things that are good to do, but you don't have to do. So knowing where that sweet spot is in just doing enough to get meaningful data that you can act upon is probably one of the bigger things that I hopefully will be able to give you some ideas on how to figure that out. Um, because this is a COVID-19 webinar series, we've been receiving here a lot of questions about, well, we're already doing a lot with teaching going online. So one of the questions we get about program assessment is, well, how do I do program assessment when everything's going virtual? My workload has increased. So again, tied in with that, hopefully, regardless of what your situation is, or there's a pandemic, the pandemic goes, there's another pandemic that happens later on, hopefully not, you'll be able to determine what processes you can implement for your case that will adapt to whatever situation comes your way. So this talk will be organized as follows. Oops, sorry. Uh, First, I'll give a brief overview of accreditation and program assessment. That will hopefully provide the context for our conversation today. And then we will talk about student outcomes and the assessment process. And we're going to focus on the systems approach to the assessment process. So items 2 and 3 will hopefully provide the framework for our conversation today. And then when we get to item 4, the case study, I will share how we conduct our assessment processes here at Chico State in the Department of Computer Science. And then we'll move on to our discussion. And by the way, the presentation slides that I'm using are available in PDF form in the URL provided. So if you are interested in grabbing that, you can do so now, or you can wait till the end of my talk where I will show that URL again. So let's get to business. So accreditation is nothing more than the review of the quality of higher education institutions and or programs. So accreditation can be at the institution level. So Chico State, we are WASC accredited, or it can be at the program level. So in my department, we have 2 programs, computer science and computer information systems. So there's also accreditation at the program level. Accreditation in the US is very important because it is a mark of excellence. So it is a symbol. It shows that a program or an institution provides a quality education. So that's why it's very important here in the US and most likely anywhere else in the world that accreditation be attained at the program level and potentially at the institutional level. So in the US, accreditation has additional meaning, and I just kind of want to go over that quickly. Oh, I'm not sure. Technical difficulties here. It's moving ahead of me. Accreditation in the US is tied to student loans. So typically when the US government provides money for student loans, it will only do that to institutions that are accredited. So it's very important in the US that institutions get accredited. That's probably different in other countries. And as Rachel mentioned, as Dr. Rojas mentioned, accreditation in the US is a little bit complex, So we have this organization uh, the CHEA, which is the Council for Higher Education Accreditation, that manages accreditation in the US. But depending on what region you're in the US, you might be accredited by a different body. So I live here in California. Let's see, where is my pointer? So I live here in California. And so this area of California and Hawaii, strangely enough, is accredited by WASC. So WASC is the Western Association of Schools and Colleges, and it's actually WASC Senior College and University Commission. They're supposedly pronouncing this acronym as WASC. That's our accrediting agency for the whole institution. So it's important for us to maintain that so we can get government money so students can apply for student loans in case they cannot afford to go to college. And so we've been accredited for a lot of years. And this is a 6-year cycle for us for WASC accreditation. And we just got reaccredited 2 years ago. One of the roles I had as an admin was I was the WASC accreditation liaison officer. So I was the connection between our institution and WASC to determine what else we need to do in order to get our reaccreditation. Let's see. So that's the picture of accreditation in the US. It's a little bit messy. So we're going to go down to the institution level. At Chico State, so I mentioned that we are WASC accredited. So that's for the university. And then within our university, we have 300 plus academic programs, and we are organized in 7 academic colleges. So one of those colleges is my home college. It's the College of Engineering, Computer Science, and Construction Management. We have 11 undergraduate programs listed on the slide. So my department, Computer Science, has 2 programs, the Computer Information Systems program and the Computer Science program. The remaining other programs are housed in other departments. Of the 11 undergraduate programs, 9 of them are accredited. Out of the 9 accredited, 7 are accredited by ABET, 5 engineering programs, and 2 computing, these 2 computing programs. Our construction management program is accredited by ACCE, and then our sustainable manufacturing program is accredited by ATME. So even though there are 3 separate accrediting bodies, the process for accreditation is still very similar. It's very outcomes based. We still have to come up with an assessment plan, an assessment cycle. So who accredits a program is really irrelevant. And I just have to share with you all, if in case you're interested or are thinking about getting involved in assessment, for me, assessment has actually been good. It was my my segue into an admin position. It appears that when I was playing around with assessment processes, upper administration liked what I was doing. And so that eventually led for opportunities for me to move up in the college administration, where I became associate dean and eventually dean for 2 years while we were searching for a permanent dean within our college, because I understood the assessment process and the accreditation requirements for these 3 accrediting bodies in our college. So it's all about developing a process. It's all about documentation, which a lot of people don't like, which could be an opportunity for you if you're listening in on the webinar, because someone that understands the whole assessment cycle, the accreditation process, is a very valued person, because no one wants to do this. So once you understand this whole process, you will most likely be a valuable person in your department. So we have these 3 accrediting bodies for the programs in our college. But at the same time, within ABET, ABET actually has 4 commissions. So you will notice here in the bottom, ABET's pretty impressive. It's probably the most known internationally accrediting body for the computing sciences and engineering. But ABET is also expanding. They want to now accredit any STEM programs. These numbers are from 2019. So back then they were accrediting more than 4,000 programs from 812 colleges and universities in 32 countries around the world. So this is very impressive. The experts that work with ABET to conduct on-site visits to reaccredit institutions or programs in institutions come from 35 professional member societies. So this is a very quality-oriented program. And my connection with ABET is I'm a professional development facilitator. So I conduct workshops, training for ABET for best practices. In fact, a lot of the evaluators sometimes have to be retrained and they have to take some of the workshops that we offer. So there are 4 commissions in ABET to focus on accrediting matters related to any STEM discipline. So for computer science, computer information systems, IT, those will probably go through the Computing Accrediting Commission or the CAC. Any engineering type degree will go through the EAC. And if it's engineering technology, it goes through ETAC. And otherwise, if it's in the natural sciences or applied and natural sciences, they go through ANSAC. And prior to this talk, I did a quick look at what are the ABET accredited programs in the Philippines. And this is what I found out from the ABET website. So there are 55 ABET accredited programs in the US. 13 are CAC accredited and 42 are EAC accredited. And the institutions are listed here on the bottom. So I found that interesting. I figured I'd share that with you. Okay, so let's talk about assessment. So assessment is nothing more than the evaluation or the estimation of the nature, quality, or ability of someone or something. So in our case, we're interested in program assessment. So before we get into the details of assessment, I'm going to ask a question. How many of you drive a car? I'm sure most of you have driven a car or continue to drive a car. So let's take a look at a car. So typically when we look at a car, the car will have a make, like if it's a Toyota, it might have a model, maybe it's a Corolla, or it will also have a type. Maybe it's a 4-door sedan or an SUV or a pickup or something. So usually when we assess the quality of a car, there's a number of things that go into assessing the quality of a car. We don't rely on just the check engine light, right? Or the oil is low or the battery is low light. So these tell us that there might be something wrong with the car or something may need attention, but it doesn't mean that the car is completely useless, right? So, so the same thing happens in program assessment. If we're assessing a car and the make of the car is kind of like the university, so let's say Toyota is a university, and they make several models, Corolla or whatever, Camry. So you can think of those maybe as branches or campuses. And then the type, the 4-door sedan or an SUV or a pickup, maybe that's the program. So if I were interested in buying a car, I need to be able to quickly assess the quality of the car. And when I test drive the car, maybe my most important thing is it can take me from point A to point B. It can take me to my destination reliably, whether it be safely or on time. That is my metric. The check engine light might go on once in a while, or maybe some other signals might, indicate a problem here and there. But it's still okay. I can still get to my destination. So these are the kinds of things that we tend to look at when we are evaluating a car. The other thing you might want to think about is when we assess a car, different cars have different bells and whistles in the dashboard or in the instrumentation. Some cars will only have a few bells and whistles, a few gauges, but some of the more modern cars have so many sensors. You know that tires are getting low, and a bunch of other things. And Do we need all of those sensors if I'm only interested in going from point A to point B? Probably not. So it's the same thing with assessment. There are many things that you could measure, but we just want to find enough for the goal or the outcome that I have in mind. So in the systems approach to program assessment, we shall take the analogy as our framework to do this. So in a systems approach to program assessment, we are interested in four things. We're interested in inputs. So when we talk about inputs to a program, it could be students' backgrounds. Depending on what institution you're in, the student backgrounds might be different. Faculty backgrounds might also be different. And also your educational resources. Maybe there's tutoring centers or what available. Those are also going to be very different. We're also interested in processes. So we started with inputs as the first part, and then processes. Different programs apply different processes, maybe different policies, different governance structures. That's also varies between program to program. Services you provide to the students, it might be also very different. Teaching load, class size. So those are all pertinent to the processes. Uh, in addition to inputs and processes, we're also interested in what the outputs are. And this is a metric that most people are used to. In the car analogy, the outputs are the check engine light turning on or the low battery light turning on. So that signals a potential problem, but not an overall problem. Other examples of outputs for program assessment could be student grades, student credit hours, amount of funding received by the faculty. So grades are not really considered a good measure for program assessment. The problem with grades is just because a student got, let's say a student got a C in your course, a grade of C doesn't tell you which topics or concepts the students struggled in. So this is the main reason why grades don't work. So instead of focusing on outputs when we conduct program assessment, we're actually more interested in outcomes. So what outcomes are, and we're going to go to a slide that defines outcomes shortly. Outcomes tend to be a bigger picture. For program assessment, these tend to be things that we expect students to do by the time they graduate. So in our car analogy, my outcome is I just want to be able to get from point A to point B. So sometimes we're driving and the gas gauge is getting low. We know we're going to make it, so we're just not going to gas up. We're just going to go ahead. So it's kind of similar, right? So it's nice to have these outputs, but it's the overall outcome that we are really most interested in. So the other thing we want to focus on when we look at the systems approach to program assessment is this idea of data collection. I know data is a struggle for a lot of people around the world, even here in the US. So in the systems approach to program assessment, those gauges and the flashing lights on your dashboard is triggered by something, and that something is your data. So we need to know what sensors we need for data collection so that we can figure out what is the cumulative effect of student learning. And as we go through the best practices, we're going to go over some ideas on when do we collect data, who do we collect the data from, and of course, the people who interpret the results have to be the faculty because this pertains to our program collectively. So the framework that I'm going to go through when we discuss assessment processes, this was developed by Peggy Mackey back in 2004 in her publication, her book, Assessing for Learning. And there's many different versions of this. So this is called an assessment cycle. And you'll see assessment cycles with 4 things, 5 things, 6 things, but they all are pretty much about the same. So I'm going to use this as our guide as we go over generically a definition of the assessment process. And then in our case study, we're going to go over each of them one at a time. So let's go ahead and do that. Bearing in mind, in our assessment processes, we are focusing on quality assurance. right? We want to show that we are providing a quality education, and we want to be able to perform any continuous improvement that is necessary for our program if improvement is required. So the first part of the assessment process we're going to look at is how do we identify the desired outcomes? And typically the way this is done is we want to identify what are the target performances. In our car analogy, I want to be able to get from point A to point B, you know. Okay, so when we're looking at program assessment, our student outcomes pretty much are statements that describe what students are expected to know or be able to do by the time they graduate. So these could be skills, knowledge, or behaviors that students acquire when they go through our program, right? So this is collectively as a faculty, this is what we've done in our, what have we provided the student so that they could achieve this outcome. And then later on, we have to figure out what is the evidence that we have that supports the fact that our students actually acquired the student outcomes. Now, um, in the program assessment literature, one of the best practices for assessing student outcomes is to use what are known as performance indicators or PIs. So as we go over some examples, you will notice that most student outcomes tend to be very broad. So it's very difficult to measure where adjustments need to be made when you look at the student outcome, for example, from ABET, as we shall see shortly. So the idea is, given a student outcome, you probably want to divide these into performance indicators or PIs. PIs are very specific, they're measurable, and they identify student performances. And so it'll be easier for us to come up with evidence if we define performance indicators. And I apologize, maybe this might not make much sense right now because we're just going over a definition, but hopefully when we go over the case study, the idea of a performance indicator will make more sense. Another way to think about a performance indicator is some people will call this course learning objectives. So it's also very similar. Some people will identify those as the same because course learning objectives tend to be very specific and very measurable. So when we look at outcomes-based program assessment, it's basically nothing more than one or more processes to not only identify, but we also need to be able to collect and prepare data so that it can be evaluated by our faculty, so that we as a faculty can determine collectively whether or not or how much our students have attained the described student outcomes. So that's what outcomes-based program assessment is. Now, when we try to identify the desired outcomes, so we need to identify what the target performances are, but if the target performances are not met, how do we address it? It's like, okay, I wasn't able to get from point A to point B, so how do I know what part of the car I need to fix? So similar idea. So the way this is done in program assessment is to develop a curriculum map. So a curriculum map is a document that demonstrates or shows the alignment of all your student outcomes to the courses in your curriculum. This is typically provided as a table. That's the most common form. I don't think I've seen one that's not a table, but there's a claim that some people provide a curriculum map in a different form. So I'll show you that to you when we get to the case study. The nice thing about this is curriculum maps will also help you decide where to do curricular adjustments if a student outcome is not attained during a particular cycle. So it definitely guides continuous improvement decision-making whenever you conduct assessment. So again, we'll hopefully make more sense when we go over the case study. The next part of the cycle is how do we assess outcomes? So this is a fairly big part of the whole process. So when we assess outcomes, we want to use both relevant direct and indirect data, and I'll describe that in the next slide. And then we might want to consider both quantitative and qualitative measures. Quantitative measures tend to be easier to use, but Qualitative measures are not required, although they are also proven to be good sources of data. So our sources of data have to be appropriate to the outcome that we're trying to measure. So to give you more information about that, so direct assessment methods are methods where the student demonstrates their learning. So faculty get to observe whether or not the student is learning the material. In indirect assessment methods, the student describes their learning. So typically this is like a self-reflection, maybe in a survey. So in our department, we conduct a graduating senior survey. And so in that survey, we ask our students how much they feel they've achieved or attained each of the student learning outcomes. So this is their own self-reflection, their interpretation of how much they've attained each of the student outcomes. So we don't observe it, so that is indirect. Listed here in bullet form are also a number of different assessment methods used. You don't have to use all of them. It's just a good idea to kind of pick some that applies to your situation. Direct assessment typically comes from courses because faculty are used to course assessment, assessing your students in your class. It's usually good practice to use a data source from an activity that you're already doing in your class. So maybe a quiz question or exam question, a lab activity. Those are good enough as a data source for assessment. But these are also some other examples. The last three parts of this cycle, interpret evidence, plan based on evidence, and implement actions, are very subjective. We might eat up a lot of time if I go over the details of that. So I will cover those when we get to the case study. Okay, so let's go on to the case study. So as I mentioned earlier, in our department, we have actually two undergraduate programs, computer information systems and computer science, but we also offer a graduate program in computer science. Um, uh, every year, we're required to write an assessment report for all programs, undergraduate and graduate. So every year, the assessment coordinator in our department writes an assessment report based on the assessment activities we've done that academic year. For the past 2 years, that's been me. I came back from an admin position and went back to teaching in 2018. And when I came back to the department, I took over the assessment processes of our department. And that's kind of what I'm sharing with you today. So let's go over the process that we use. So, oh, I forgot to mention, you probably noticed this middle part of the assessment cycle. So everything needs to be aligned, right? Your institutional and unit vision, mission, goals, and objectives need to all be aligned. I apologize that I missed that. So let's see how we identify our desired outcomes. That's the first piece in this cycle. So in our department, because our programs are ABET accredited, and we offer computing programs, so we are accredited under the Computing Accreditation Commission, or the CAC in ABET. We don't make up our own student outcomes. We just use the ones that ABET has. ABET has several criteria, and one of them is the student outcomes. And so to make our life simple, and this is common for most ABET accredited programs, they will just use the student outcomes that are not really mandated, but recommended by ABET. So ABET has these 5 for all computing programs. So they should look familiar. We should be able to make sense out of them. And then because we have 2 programs, our computer science programs, student outcome number 6 is different from the student outcome number 6 for our computer information systems program. A lot of crossover, but still very different from each other. So that's how we determine our student outcomes. Some departments in our college will modify some of these outcomes slightly. For example, our mechanical engineering program in the college took outcome number 3 and decided to divide that into communicate effectively orally and in written form. So they decided to separate those, which could be performance indicators also, but they decided that there were two separate student outcomes. And again, it really depends on what you want to do. You just need to document your process. Next, let's look at performance indicators. So back in 2018 was the first time my department used performance indicators. And because performance indicators are very specific, what I decided to use as a reference is ACM's Computer Science Curricula 2013, or CS 2013. Some of you may have seen this. The ACM CS 2013 consists of the body of knowledge that's broken up into 18 knowledge areas, or KAs. Each of the KAs is organized by knowledge units, which I shall call KUs. And then the KUs have corresponding set of learning outcomes. So on the first time we used performance indicators, we selected learning outcomes from this ACM CS 2013 as an example to show you what they look like from the document. So if we look at the knowledge area called Software Development Fundamentals, or SDF, SDF is broken up into the following knowledge units, so algorithms and design, development methods, and so on. And then if I pick the fundamental data structures knowledge unit, then I come up with, here's some example learning outcomes. So very specific: identify and describe uses of primitive data types. The orange text here that says familiarity, usage, or assessment sort of corresponds to Bloom's taxonomy. So what level of learning, if it's higher or lower level. So familiarity is the lowest level, usage is middle, and then assessment is the higher level learning. So obviously in upper division courses, we expect our students to perform this evaluate, analyze type of activities and demonstrate them in order for us to have evidence that the students learn the concepts that are covered in our classes. Now, because there's so many choices in learning outcomes from ACM CS 2013, what I did was I developed an online dashboard to help faculty filter what student outcomes what performance indicators from the ACM document might fit each particular student outcome. And so let me show you what that looks like. Let's see. Let me share this one. Okay, so again, if you downloaded the slides, you should be able to see where we are. So here is what the dashboard looks like. Let me make that a little bigger. So the idea here is faculty could pick a knowledge unit. So maybe I was interested in software development fundamentals, and then I can go to a particular knowledge unit. Maybe I'm only interested in fundamental data structures, maybe development methods. I can click that, apply. So all it's doing is it's going to filter. The data source was nothing more than an Excel spreadsheet. I can select a learning outcome category. So this is the Bloom's level. If I wanted the higher level assessment, middle level familiarity, or low level usage. So let's just keep all of them on. And then some of them, this happened to be all core tier 1 in ABET. So now it starts listing some potential learning outcomes. So I can pick any one of these that apply to me depending on the level of learning that we expect our students to do. So this was helpful for us in deciding what our performance indicators were going to be for each of our learning outcomes. And you don't have to do it that way. That's just how we did it in my department. So we identified our student outcomes because they're based on ABET, and then we identified our performance indicators for each of the student outcomes. The next thing we did was to come up with a curriculum map. So let me show you what that looks like. So a curriculum map is nothing more than aligning all our courses to each of the outcomes. And we want to be able to indicate when an outcome is introduced, practiced, or assessed. And our curriculum map is a permanent part of our assessment plan. So this is what our curriculum map looks like. So for our computer science program, we have all our core courses listed here on the first column. And then the next 6 columns are each of the 6 student outcomes, the 1 through 5 from ABET CAC. And then number 6 is the computer science outcome number 6. I means that that particular student outcome is introduced, P is practiced, and A is assessed. And whenever it's A is assessed, that means that this course, so for example, the CSCI 301 has an A for outcomes 3 and 4. That means they are a potential candidate for gathering assessment data each year. So that's how we determine where to gather assessment data from. So if an outcome is not achieved, let's say our scores for outcome 5 are low, we'll know which courses we might have to make adjustments in our curriculum in order to address any shortcomings for that particular outcome. So this is why a curriculum map is very important. It not only helps you, but it also helps a third person, maybe a program evaluator, if you're applying for accreditation. It's clear that you know which part of your curriculum needs to be addressed if there are any potential issues as signified by your data. We have the same table for our computer information systems program, but I'm not going to spend time on that. It looks like we're doing good on time. Okay, so next, let's look at the assess the outcomes. How do we gather data? How often do we gather data? Where do we get our data from? So that's the assess the outcomes. So in our department, we have implemented a staggered 3-term cycle. So each term, Chico State, is a semester. So here I show 3 academic years, the 2018-19, 19-20, and 2021 academic year. So this is the 3 years in our assessment cycle. Next to that, if you'll notice, we have in the first 2 columns are the student outcomes that we're going to be assessing. In our assessment cycle, in our schedule, our A means we're going to assess, gather data for that student outcome during that term. So in the following term, the E means we are going to evaluate and discuss the results from the assessment, the data gathering from the prior semester. So if you'll notice, we are aligning the odd numbered student outcomes 1, 3, and 5, gathering assessment data in fall 2018. And then in spring 2019, we're actually evaluating the results from the data, right? So to figure out if there's anything wrong. Concurrent to that, we are also gathering data in the even numbered student outcomes. And then when we get to the third term, C means change. That's when we implement any changes to the curriculum if necessary. So that just gives us enough time to go through the curricular change process for it to be in effect, hopefully by the next time we gather data for that particular student outcome. So if you'll notice, we actually have a semester where we don't gather data. So one of the things I've learned in the process of being involved in assessment is it's common for departments, and we as a department did this as well. We gathered assessment data every semester, and it was assessment fatigue. It was just too much. It was a lot of data. There wasn't really enough time to put it together to make sense out of it. So this staggering approach has become more common, where it will actually take us 2 years, right, 4 semesters to have a full cycle, assess, evaluate, and change for all 6 student outcomes. but that's okay. So you don't have to have a full assess, evaluate, change in one semester or even in 1 year. We decided to spread it over 2 years, and it has been a blessing. Um, I'm not as hated anymore, I guess, in our department because I'm not bugging people to give me data as often as I used to. Let me show you how we gather the assessment data for our department. So that's what I'm going to show you next. So this is for the coming fall 2020 semester and the previous spring 2020 semester that just passed. So for each student outcome, so it's the odd numbered outcomes uh, that are, we're going to be gathering data from last spring 2020. So those are just wrapping up uh, before the start of fall. And then next semester in fall 2020, we're going to be gathering data from the even numbered student outcomes. So if you'll notice, based on our curriculum map, we look at which courses are mapped to each of the student outcomes. And then we just select some of the courses. We don't select all the courses to gather data from. We used to. There was just too much data. You don't need to gather tons of data to get a sense of what's going on. You just need enough sensors, enough data to let you know that there might be a problem. We did this intentionally, so we're being mindful of the workload for our faculty. We tried to cut down for each semester. Each faculty should not be providing assessment data for more than, if possible, one course, maximum two courses, and that's it. And we've been relatively successful in doing that, except for next semester, it looks like Challenger is on the list for a number of courses in the fall, and they'll probably not be happy about that. Um, so that's how we schedule when to gather assessment data from our courses that faculty teach. So this is direct assessment. So in order to gather the direct assessment data from our faculty, we decided to use a Google form where faculty indicate which student outcome they're providing data from, and then if they're providing data for a particular student outcome, what are the performance indicator or indicators that they used. And then they also indicate which course activity, deliverable, exam question, homework problem, or any other artifact they use. So it could be an exam question. It could be just one lab activity, and that's enough. And then they provide what are the maximum points and then the actual raw data so that we can normalize it. So this is direct assessment because faculty observe the students and then they rate how well the students achieve the particular performance indicator that they're gathering assessment data from. When we go to indirect assessment, we actually have three major sources of indirect assessment data. Each semester, we have a college-wide senior exit survey that we conduct, and we intentionally have questions there that ask students how they feel they've achieved each of the student outcomes. So that's an indirect measure. We've also been using the ETS major field test in order to gather data for student achievement of the student outcomes. So that's a standardized test available from ETS. We use that for our computer science majors. And then for our computer information systems major, we use the ICCP IS 2010 certification exam as our standardized exam to figure out how well they've achieved the student outcomes. Let me see, do I have time to do that? I'll save that for Q&A. So the last three portions here, the interpret the evidence, plan based on evidence, and then implement any actions. I'm just gonna show you what we did. So we gathered the data from the courses based on our curriculum map, and those were entered on a Google form by the faculty. We have our senior survey data. We have our standard exam, standard exams, the MFT and the ICCP. So we gathered all that data. Before we finalized our program assessment reports, we end up putting all this data on a dashboard so that faculty can play around with the data. look at it themselves on their own time before we discuss it at a department meeting. Now let me show you what that looks like. So that particular dashboard looks like this. So it's a little bit involved. And again, I'm not saying you have to do this. In fact, this actually started as an Excel spreadsheet. And then I had pivot tables and graphs. And we just passed that around. And then eventually it was shared online. We have Tableau available on our campus, although I'm not using our campus license. This is just from Tableau Public, which is freely available. So I take the Excel spreadsheet and come up with, work with the faculty to come up with a design that will hopefully help us assess our programs. So the dark red bars are for our computer science program, and then the gray bars are for the computer information systems program. On the left, it might be hard for you to read, are the 6 student outcomes from ABET. So that's the left part of the diagram. On the right part of the diagram are the performance indicators grouped by the student outcome. As a department, we agreed on a 70% target. So if the scores are below a 70%, then it's a trigger that we might have to review our curriculum. And those stand out right here, right? So we see for computer science, there are some bars that are low that could indicate an issue for our program. The dashboard is very interactive. So for example, because this is under outcome 6 for computer science, I can click here and it will only show on the right-hand side outcome 6, which is indicated here, and all the performance indicators associated with that outcome. And so the 2 that fall below the threshold, the target, are these 2. One is convert among equivalently powerful notations for a language. Computing theory. I know people don't like that a lot. And then the second one is implement and host a data-based web application. So one of our core courses is a web programming class, and it looks like students had a difficult time with that, and that's why the scores were low. So it provides us an opportunity to identify what potential concepts students are struggling with. It opens up discussions in our department about what potential adjustments, if any, need to be made in our curriculum based on the results. Sometimes we'll wait and see if the numbers improve or get worse in the following semester before we do anything. But this dashboard allows the faculty to look at this on their own, and then during the meeting, we cover it as well so that we can quickly see the data and play around with it to facilitate our conversations. So, so that's how we discuss the results of our assessment process. And then just to kind of show you our assessment processes in general. So we have embedded assessments. That's how we gather data from the faculty. So it could be an exam or an exam question. It could be group work. It could be a lab or maybe a presentation by a student. So those are gathered from the faculty. They enter that in a Google form. We have our senior exit survey and any standardized examination. So these are our data sources, and those are gathered by the assessment coordinator. The data actually comes from the faculty. They're always involved in the process. The assessment coordinator compiles the data together. In this case, I put together the dashboard, feed it with the new data, let the faculty know that it's available. They get to look at the results, look at the trending. So we can also do trending of our data from year to year. And then we talk about it at least one, usually multiple department meetings to figure out what's going on. Based on that, I put together an assessment report because every year we're required to submit an assessment report in our university. And then we get feedback from our associate dean regarding the report. So that's the whole process we have. So just kind of trying to wrap up a few things before we get into Q&A. Some key points I hope you take away from our discussion and maybe more in detail in the Q&A. Any program assessment process in particular, it's never perfect. It needs to be regularly reviewed. We're reviewing, assessing, evaluating our program. We also need to do the same um, with our assessment process because there could be problems with it. It's not always going to be perfect. And so we need to make sure that we're actually getting useful, meaningful information that faculty firmly believe they can make adjustments to the curriculum when necessary. So that's a very important point. Without this, faculty will just think that you're gathering data and it all goes in a black box and nothing's really happening. And unfortunately, that tends to be a common misconception about assessment. The next point, although I've covered performance indicators in this presentation, it is not required. It is a best practice because it allows us to have actionable assessment results. Faculty know exactly where to make adjustments in the curriculum if needed. Student outcomes are too broad. So if the issue is in communication, how do you know where to make curricular adjustments if you don't have more specific measurable performance indicators to tell you where to make those adjustments? And then finally, the last point, hopefully you can take away from our conversation, is that your assessment process is unique to your unit's characteristics. There are a lot of factors involved in this. How many faculty members do you have? How many faculty members are in your department? What's the teaching load like? And what's the budget look like if you're interested in sending people to training? So it all boils down to being mindful of your faculty's workload. It really requires that someone take a hold of the process and run away with it. Um, and if you find that person, or maybe you're going to be that person, then things tend to move more smoothly. These are available in the slide deck in PDF, so hopefully you'll take a look at it. The one thing I wanted to point out is the uh, ABET has some assessment webinars available for free that just describes certain parts of the whole process. You might want to check that out. There are also some paid assessment workshops that ABET provides, and they're really very good. I'm not saying that just because I run a couple of them, but they really are very good. And then if you're interested in any of the visualizations, I provide a link to that. And there's two other resources here that you might want to consider as well. With that, I would like to open for any questions from the floor.
Thank you very much, Professor Ben, for that very impressive and comprehensive presentation. We'll give you a few minutes to catch your breath while the participants also provide their questions through the
Okay,
Q&A box. We'll also take this opportunity to make some announcements. Please note that the webinar that is provided by CSP and through our speaker is free. But if the participants will require a certificate of attendance, we provide the certificates of participation to CSP members and upon request. So please inform the CSP Secretariat. We have participants from, of course, the National Capital Region, from Laguna, Pangasinan, Leyte, Negros Occidental. Thank you for participating. Davao del Norte, and Misamis Oriental. We also have a participant from Bulacan. Nagpahabol siya, Bulacan.
wow, good.
And also from India, we have a participant
Wow,
who tuned in from India, Pampanga, and Ilocos Norte. So thank you for participating. So let's go to the questions. Do we have questions? Um, Maybe I'll start the to
okay.
provide the question. So in the Philippine context, because as you've mentioned, the context in the US is different. I think we have not gotten to that point that accreditation is looked at by the government, no, the departments of the CHED, Commission on Higher
Yeah,
Education, is
yeah,
not yet using accreditation as a basis for scholarship.
yeah.
Uh, why would a Philippine higher education institution push for international accreditation based on your
Good question.
experience?
So I'm gonna answer that based on our graduate program at Chico State. So we offer a Master of Science in Computer Science at Chico State, and one of our requirements is that the applicant needs to come from an accredited program. So when I say accredited program, it doesn't have to be ABET. So different countries, like you mentioned, Philippines has their own accrediting body and their own accrediting process. So if someone from one of the Philippine accredited programs, if a graduate from one of the Philippine accredited programs were to apply for an MS degree in computer science at Chico State, they would be accepted because there's alignment. ABET is also a member of the Seoul Accord. So members of the Seoul Accord have agreed that their processes are pretty similar to each other. So they've received the stamp of approval. The process has been approved. So we know that that student will be successful in our program. That, does that answer your question? So I think it's important for I think it's important for Philippine institutions that have undergraduate degrees and they foresee their students pursuing graduate degrees internationally that they consider accreditation, because some institutions may require that an applicant for graduate study must come from an accredited undergraduate institution
Mhm. Thank you
or
for
under,
that.
accredited program.
Yeah.
I know in the Philippines you don't have accredited institutions; it's
Uh-huh.
accrediting programs. Okay.
Okay, thank you for that. How
You're
about
welcome.
institutions that are looking at university ranking? Is there a relationship between accreditation and getting your institutions in the global ranking?
So that's a good question. So in the US, the only connection between and ranking and accreditation, program level accreditation,
Mm-hmm.
is that because student loans are connected to institutional accreditation, um, usually the rankings in the US also look at how many students get loans. In fact, we're interested in how many students default on their loans, they can't pay it. So those are the kind of things we also look at. So maybe my answer to the question, I don't think it's that big a connection here in the US, but there is some connection.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Can I
Um,
ask?
yes, Jimmy.
Yes. Uh, for your survey to the students prior to
The senior
graduation,
survey.
the senior survey, can you share some sample questions that you would ask in such a survey?
Sure. Um, in fact, I could probably just send a copy of it. Would that help? Uh,
Yes. Yes.
I'll describe some things we do. We actually break it down into, there's somewhat a student satisfaction portion of the survey. So we ask our students like, what they think of our labs, what they think of our facilities, so that we can get an idea if, they don't like this. And then we use the same outcomes and then we ask them how they feel they've attained. And usually they say their numbers are higher than what we've seen in the courses. But it's still a good idea to look at. They always hate the continuous lifelong learning type things. They feel they're not so good about that. Um, and so yeah, I'm happy to share a copy of the questions we have. It's
Thank you.
nice to use the same outcomes because then in our assessment report we can show both direct and indirect assessment, and then we can show the difference between the two.
Thank you.
Mhm. Thank you, Dr.
Oh, and
Carol.
I was also going to add to your question earlier, the first question. I have noticed that more parents are, at least here in the US, more parents are aware of accreditation.
Mhm.
So usually during student orientation before the school year starts, we'll have a couple of parents that will ask if our program is accredited, even though it says on our website. So more parents are aware. Um, I guess faculty are somewhat aware when they apply for a job. Students have no clue what accreditation is.
Yeah, thank you. Also, for the previous question, there's a note here from Mr. Miguel Carpio that the Commission
Mhm.
on Higher Education uses program level and institutional accreditations for institutions that are applying for autonomous status and deregulated status. That's true. There are specific points that are given to the assessment of schools that have undergone program and institutional
Okay,
accreditations.
good.
Yeah. So, okay, so can we
Thank you.
go to the next question? I think
Uh-huh.
it's 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 um accrediting computing programs,
Uh-huh.
uh, and then you're using technology also as a tool to. I think it's in the ingenious
Yeah,
using it as a
I think
tool
that's
to,
why
yeah, to collect
I think that's why I
data.
got into it.
Uh-huh.
So I also had the opportunity to be the director of our institutional research office on campus. So I played with a lot of data. And so that's how I kind of developed this knack of how to present data so that faculty can figure out what's going on. And
Mm-hmm.
again, I don't know. My advice for each department is just to find someone who will be passionate about this, because if you, and there's bound to be someone, and if there isn't anyone, appoint one, because that's what happened to me. And then I eventually liked it. But yeah, it's a lot of work. And because we're in computing, this is the CSP, so I'm assuming that most participants are in the computing and the technology field.
Mm-hmm.
We actually
Mm-hmm.
have an advantage, you know uh, putting together data, coming up with a process. I mean, that's kind of what we do. We want to streamline the process, so we're always thinking of a better way to do things that that will be good for our faculty and for our students.
Mm-hmm. So you
Yeah.
use the tool to collect data, to systematize the process, and to visualize. So
Visualize. Yeah.
all
Yes.
the three stages are in one tool.
Yes. And then I'm actually in the process of training a younger faculty member to do this, because I don't intend to do this forever. And of course, I've documented everything I've done so that whoever takes over can hopefully continue with the process.
So aside from using the tool, there's a question here. Do you have like a team? Do you have
Good
people that
question.
are helping you?
Very good question. So in our department, we have an assessment committee. So there's only 10 faculty in our department. So one of our department committees is the assessment committee. There's only three of us, and one of them is the chair. There's the chair, myself, and a uh, junior faculty member. So we work together, and then before we present results to the faculty, we talk about it, and then we present it to the faculty. And we all bug people to provide data, and we help each other out. Like the Google form was actually put together by the young faculty member, and so we share in the load. But a majority of the load is done by me because I'm the chair of that committee.
Yeah, since you mentioned that you have to bug the faculty members, there's a question here. How do you get the buy-in of the faculty members, since their
Okay,
involvement is really critical to this process?
so I'm going to answer that question with a story. uh, So I have a colleague in English, and she is the assessment coordinator in her department. And she shared with me a story once. So she and I had the same introduction to assessment. She was appointed to do assessment by her chair. and they had no process. So she made up a process, she gathered data, and she presented the results. Unfortunately, in the results, they were bad. The results on her first year were that there was a problem here, here, and here. The good thing about that is the faculty disagreed with her. And so they were questioning her approach. They were questioning why this, it cannot be true, it cannot be possible. But the nice thing is it actually started a conversation among the faculty. So then they worked together to try to improve the process, to try to, figure out how they can get more reliable evidence of things. And it actually worked out. In my case, maybe my advantage is, so I was assessment coordinator before I became an administrator, but I think my administrative experience maybe gives me some clout. I don't know. People kind of believe that what I say might have some value. I don't know. And I laugh a lot.
So
and I'm always
put
and I'm
humor
always
into the equation.
Yes, and I'm always eager to find an easier way to do things.
Mm-hmm.
So I want them to know that I'm here to help them. And so even when they're filling out the form, sometimes we'll have faculty that will have a question, and I just ask, I'm here to help.
Okay, thank you. With regards to student outcomes, for the computer science program, because I'm also involved with the Commission on Higher Education, so the CHED memorandum order for our computer science degrees are already aligned with the ACM
Okay.
computer science curriculum
Uh-huh.
recommendations. So CMO
Uh-huh.
25 series of 2015. Uh, but there's a question here from CHED Regional Office, Jamie Mateo. Thank you
Uh-huh.
for coming in, listening to our webinar from Zamboanga City. The
Okay.
question is about student outcomes. Are there standards with regards to how we should write student outcomes? Should it be action verbs
Oh, okay.
okay, so
Or would it be
so it
better
would be
to answer?
easier to assess. So in the case
So,
for
yeah.
computer science, we already use the ACM. As you've mentioned, we don't have to reinvent things, right? So we
Right. So it's
adapted,
yeah.
yeah.
So in our case, kind of similar to the PCAB accredited, from what I understand, we just use our accrediting body's list of student outcomes. And as I mentioned earlier, you don't have to, but if you want to be accredited by ABET or PCAB, you have to align your student outcomes to their outcomes. Without that, you're going to run into problems. So you can come up with your own outcomes. And some people will do that, but you have to align it with your accrediting body. And as I mentioned, we have one department who modified the outcomes a little bit. You can do that. The biggest thing here is you need to think about if the numbers fall below your threshold, if you're using a threshold, what does that mean? Where will you perform the adjustments in your curriculum? So your curriculum map is very important. If your outcomes are very broad, you will have a very difficult time figuring out exactly where in the curriculum to do those adjustments. That's why I mean, it's not impossible. I think it'll be just hard to convince a third party that that is the connection. But if you use performance indicators, then it's clear where in the curriculum adjustments need to be made.
Mhm. Thank you for the PICAB documents. They are also aligned with or adopted from the ABET
Oh, good.
student outcomes. So I think it will be easier to just adopt it.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
good.
There's another question here. So how does the pandemic affect the expected program or learning outcome? Because now we
So yeah,
are
yeah,
moving to online learning.
yes. So that is a very good question. So on the one hand, whether a course is taught online or face to face shouldn't matter. I mean, a student learning outcome is a student learning outcome. On the other hand, it's a very good question because faculty are very much interested if the attainment of the outcome is lower with online versus face to face. And I'm going to speculate that it will be maybe. Um, in our institution, there's a lot of question about synchronous versus asynchronous teaching because last semester, in the middle of the semester when COVID-19 hit, it appears based on our data that a lot of faculty went asynchronous, and our student learning center where they do tutoring, they were hearing a lot of complaints from students that asynchronous did not work for them. They preferred synchronous online. So we don't have the data yet, but in answer to your question, it doesn't affect the learning outcome, but the level of attainment would be interesting to compare prior data
Mhm.
to data during the pandemic.
Mhm. So the assessment, just a follow up
Sure.
question. So the assessment should should address the student outcomes as specified, right? So
Yes.
it's actually an opportunity to declutter the the syllabus, the
Yes.
items.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if it
Yeah.
doesn't address a student outcome, so it shouldn't be in the course, right?
Right. In fact, in our department, based on our curriculum map, each faculty's syllabus needs to indicate what student ABET student outcome is covered by that class. And then we also list all the performance indicators, which are course learning outcomes. So those are now required in our syllabus. We made that a decision so that when we reapply for accreditation, it's clear also on our syllabus which outcomes we're trying to address.
Okay. Thank you for the reply. Do we have other questions? Not to put you on the spot, but maybe we need another webinar too.
uh, let me know what's on your mind and maybe I'll think about it. Yeah, sure. I
Thank
mean,
you.
I'm happy to talk about assessment or maybe other things as well.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Maybe some of the schools represented here are just shy. So are you open to to help some of our schools as maybe a consultant, or so that if they have further questions, maybe they can tap into your expertise.
Um, uh, Feel free to contact me. My contact information are on the slides. Best way to get a hold of me is via email. If it's something quick, I can respond to it. I do teach. I have a fairly heavy teaching load this coming semester, so depending on how involved the question is, that might impact my response time. But I'm happy to help out, uh, of course, with my kababayans.
Thank you very much. So So I guess that will be the end of our webinar. So thank you very much. First of all, Dr. or Professor Ben Juliano, thank you very
No
much
problem.
for
I hope
accepting our
everyone,
invite.
yeah,
Thank you
I
for
hope,
all our participants
I hope you all had fun.
from.
I had fun.
Yeah, thank you. Very insightful and comprehensive presentation. Very impressive presentation.
Thank you. Thank
Thank
you.
you to our participants as well who came from North to Southern Philippines and also from India. We have a participant from India. So important, it's important that you put in humor. That's one of the takeaways of Professor Juliano. Put humor into it, masyado ng seryoso ang
Otherwise, you'll lose
accreditation.
your hair like me.
And thank you very much to our organizers.
Yes,
Of
thank
course,
you.
we have who put everything together. Our CSP Secretariat, Alfred, for putting in the marketing materials. Dr. Rafael Cabredo of De La Salle University. our colleagues from the Department of Computer Science of UP Diliman, Dr. Jaime Caro, and the rest of the CSP Board of Directors. Thank you. Thank you to our, again, participants and also to our speaker for today, Professor Ben Juliano. So thank you everyone
Thank you.
for coming and have a good day.
Bye.